Well, new beginnings feel really good, don't they? But rarely last. Have you noticed that? Have you ever noticed how nothing new actually really seems to stay good for very long? So you decorate your house, or you buy a new car, or you buy a new pair of trainers, if those things are a little bit further down the line in life. And it's not long before they're looking tired, is it? They're looking a bit manky. They're looking a bit dirty. The newness, the freshness has gone. And that really does seem to be the way of the world. Everything decays around us. Everything wears out. Everything dies eventually. And it's got to be renewed, or it's got to be replaced, or it's got to be restored in some way and cleaned. It's pretty depressing, actually, isn't it? We're fighting against this every day. You know, you clean a room and you shut the door and, you come back in a few weeks later and it's dusty everywhere. Perhaps you know the Greek legend of Sisyphus. You heard of Sisyphus? Interesting character. He managed to cheat death twice, so the legend goes. And so Hades punished him by forcing him to roll a boulder up a hill. That doesn't sound too bad. But every time the boulder neared the top of the hill, it would roll back down, and Sisyphus had to go back down and start all over again. And this would continue into eternity. Now, I bet death started to look pretty attractive to Sisyphus after a while, which is probably the point. It's a story that captures this idea, doesn't it, of relentless futility, endless cycles, no progress, no development, activity that really goes nowhere. You look like you're solving a problem and then there's just another one, or it repeats itself. Now, we're about 9 chapters into the Bible, so we're really, in the grand scheme of things, we've not got very far, have we? We're still really at the beginning. And already we see in there what looks like potentially a similar situation. A straightforward reading of the preceding chapters, okay, and just reading it as it is there written on a page, and it would tell us that there's only really been about 10 generations since Adam and his wife left the garden. Just 10 generations. 10 generations was all it took to bring the world to a state where God had to say, enough! The wickedness of man is now so great on the earth that every intention of the thoughts of his heart is only evil continually. So what will stop everything following exactly the same path that it did? That's the question really this morning, isn't it? We didn't get very far. 10 generations into the history of the world, and already it's so bad it has to be wrapped up. What's going to stop that cycle repeating and repeating? That's the issue we're concerned with this morning. And that's what we're going to consider in the first half of chapter 9 now as we look at it. Now, Noah's been introduced to us. We've heard his story, really. He's described as a righteous man. Do you remember? He's righteous. He stands out in his generation, the Bible tells us. He is blameless, and he walks with God. But we will discover in the second half of chapter 9, so next time we're in Genesis, that even this righteous man, this standout man, disgraces himself before we get to the end of chapter 9. It was a collection, this is the long and short of it. It was a collection of sinners saved by grace, yes, but sinners that got onto the ark, and it's a collection of sinners that step off the ark after the flood. Indeed, we ended chapter 8, just have a look at it, with a condemning summary of the problem still. The problem with every one of us, no exceptions. Have a look at it. We're told at the end of chapter 8 there, in the last couple of verses, the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. That is what we're like. The intention of our hearts is evil even from our youth. Now, that's something we don't really want to believe, actually, isn't it? People struggle to believe that. They fight against that statement. That all of us are born with this seed of sin in our hearts that is just waiting to sprout and make itself known that it was there all the time. And it's actually pretty hard for us to believe that we are as bad as we actually are. You meet very few rational people who think that they are perfect. But most people believe that they are, probably in their words, they say, basically good. Basically good. They look at the world around them and say, yeah, I'm basically good. I'm not as bad as the rest of the world is. Now, if that's what you believe, then what Jesus says is very offensive. Listen to this. In John chapter 8, Jesus replied, talking to a crowds, he says, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Jesus there is telling the crowds, if you're sinning, listen, it's not just a lapse. Okay? It shows that sin owns you. It's your master. Sin owns you. And if it's not subdued in some way or the reins are not pulled on it, it'll soon have you dancing to its own tune, cracking the whip, making you do its bidding. That's the state of mankind. And we saw last time that Noah gets this. Noah actually does seem to understand this. That's why the first item on his agenda, you remember, is as soon as he steps off the ark, he builds an altar. And he makes sacrifices to God in recognition, in thanksgiving and recognition of the grace, the completely undeserved favor that he's found in God's eyes and that he and his family have been shown. He knows it has to be paid for because he too is a sinner. And that's the story so far then, isn't it? Now, we all like a fresh start, don't we? And this is a fresh start moment in the Bible, isn't it? Genesis chapter 9. Stepped off the ark. Everything is clean. I mean, have you ever watched a little kid with a fresh piece of paper? You ever done this? I'm sure parents do this. You give them a fresh piece of paper, and they have in their mind they are going to produce the best piece of artwork that the world has ever seen. And so they get out a pencil, and they start their lovely piece of artwork, and they make a mistake. Almost immediately, as soon as the pencil touches the paper, what do? Take the paper. Can I have a new sheet of paper? You know, that's it. It's not, they don't even want to use a rubber because a rubber is going to mar this beautiful, clean sheet of paper. This sheet of paper was potential. It was beautiful. We love a clean sheet, don't we? Now, it must have been tempting to think as Noah and his family stepped onto this newly washed world. Do you know, we will be better. It must have been tempting to think, we'll be better. We won't be like those who went before us. We will not return to their wicked ways. We'll be better. But obviously they did. How do we know? Well, we read about it in the rest of the Bible. And actually we see it in our world today. We returned pretty much to the same state, haven't we? So what will God do? How will God then stop history repeating itself? I mean, in other words, how is it possible we are still here today and God hasn't wiped us out again? Well, before we look at what God does do, it's worth saying that we believe that the Bible plainly teaches that God is sovereign, that he rules over history. As some people say, history is his story. Perhaps the most striking statement of this is found in Isaiah chapter 46. Take a look at this. Isaiah 46, God speaks and says, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand and I will do all that I please. From the east I summon a bird of prey, from a far-off land a man to fulfill my purpose. What I have said, that will I bring about. What I have planned, that will I do. It's pretty blunt, isn't it? The psalmist says much the same thing. Look at Psalm 33. The plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. You see what that's saying about God? Now, why do I draw our attention to this right at this point? Just to say that we must not think of God here as reacting to unforeseen actions of his creation. You know, like plan A, the garden. Okay, that didn't work. So plan B, outside the garden. Okay, that's looking a bit ropey. Okay, so plan C, let's flood the earth, let's start again. Like as if God is sort of adjusting and changing his mind all the time. No, history with all of its ups and downs that perhaps we don't understand very well has, according to God's word, only one intricate plot that God has already written. The story is written. God was grieved when he saw the mess and the pain of the world. We read about that in chapter 6. He was angered at the sin, grieved by it, but his plans were still unfolding exactly according to his grand design. That's the picture of God that we have in the Bible. So we shouldn't think of the flood then as being like God screwing up the page, throwing it in the bin and going and getting another sheet of paper to start again. No, it's more like God turns the page of his book and starts to write the next chapter of his plot. And you'll notice as we start out into Genesis 9 that God's instructions to mankind, this time represented by Noah and his family, they are basically mankind, aren't they? They are remarkably similar, those instructions, to those that were given to the first man and woman. Do you see? God's ultimate purpose for humanity has not changed. Take a look at verse 1. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." I mean, that should be a hauntingly familiar sentence. Again, look at verse 7. "As for you, be fruitful and increase in number. Multiply on the earth and increase upon it." I mean, it's an echo of Genesis chapter 1, isn't it? God's purpose for humanity, it hasn't changed. His purpose is that they are fruitful, that they increase, that they fill the earth. His purpose is that the earth would be filled with people made in his image bearers. It gets mentioned again in verse 6 if you look. Those who walk in such a way, who live in such a way, as to reflect the glory of God in all that they do. That's God's ultimate purpose for the world. That sounds great, but we already know that without help, they fail to do this. That isn't what happened. In chapter 9, we see then three things that threaten this intention, this master plan of God for mankind. Three things that will be addressed by putting some kind of a new order in place. There's going to be some new things added to the plot of the story. Let's look at them. The three threats then that we're looking at this morning are, they're very interesting. The first threat is the animals in their fallen state against mankind. The second threat is mankind themselves. Left unchecked, we are a violent and murderous race. That's the conclusion. And the third threat to this plan is God himself. God himself. The greatest threat of all to sinful humanity is a holy God. We'll finish there. But I wanted to say, chapters 8, verse 20 then, all the way through to 9:17, they are one complete section. They're a unit there telling us what God ordains, what God says, so that after this fresh start is given to mankind, we might actually survive some of these threats that are pitched against us actually fulfilling God's purposes for us. So let's have a look at those all one at a time. First of all, the animals then. Take a look with me then at verse 2. "The fear and dread of you, says God, will fall upon all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, now I give you everything. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it." Something has changed again in the created order here, hasn't it? There's been a fundamental change, actually a foundational change. See, the fall, we saw it, didn't we, brought the whole of creation into disorder. We saw back in chapter 3, didn't we, that the relationship between mankind and the natural world has become cursed. It explains the world that we live in today. So we saw the snake representing both the creatures of creation themselves as well as also being a figure of Satan. We see there that this creature is locked into a heel-striking, head-crushing relationship with mankind. So animals like bears and wolves and big cats, they present a very real danger to mankind. And so we read here that God puts the fear of man into them. A fear that makes them keep their distance. We see it, don't we? Yeah? Now, we're given very sketchy details here, but I imagine that the unfallen state, so before sin entered the world, the state of animals was to assist mankind. They were part of God's abundant provision for mankind. But when the curse fell, it seems many of them became predatory. Others of them needed to be tamed and controlled and brought back under man's control. Well, additionally now, in addition to the fear of man being on the animals, now animals will also become food. Now, let's get a little cheer from those who are not vegetarian. Mankind, you see, is not just to be a caretaker of the living creatures. Now he can eat them. Now, that sounds great to some of us, okay? I myself am a big fan of meat eating. I do like to eat meat, but this is tinged with a bit of sadness, really, isn't it? I mean, the joy of sinking your teeth into a lovely steak, but also a sadness that this has happened. And I think perhaps this sounds great, and some of us like this verse because it says, yes, God says you can eat meat. It's like God's put it there, like eat them, yeah? But actually, that's probably because we're not involved in killing the animals, isn't it? Don't you think? You know, if animals don't come in nice little plastic packages for us to just, heat up and serve or pop in the microwave. That's not how animals are. There's something this is a sadness, actually, isn't it? The animals must give their lives. Probably Noah and his family would initially have had to have eaten some of those animals to survive, perhaps to supplement their diet. I don't know. But as they killed these animals, they would have to watch the life drain from another creature. Why? So that they might themselves live, eat and live. All as a consequence, actually, of their sin. And drain the blood they must, according to verse 4, look. They have to do that. Now, some suggest that's some sort of a prohibition against just, you see an animal and you tuck into it. You just grab the thing and bite it. That sounds like a bizarre interpretation of what's going on here, but never mind. It seems more likely to me, God is laying down a principle here, actually. That the life generally, life in these animals is represented by the blood. And life belongs to God. Don't be all careless and haphazard with life. Life belongs to God, not mankind. It's interesting, isn't it? Reading recently, a scientist pointing out that we cannot create life. You give the best scientist every bit of the ingredients they need for a living cell. So give them a living cell, kill that cell, and all you need to ask the scientist is, could you just bring it back to life again? That is not something we can do. Life fundamentally belongs to God, and it's represented in this symbol here of the blood. We are not, it seems to me here, we are not to take life for no reason. We're not to take life as a leisure activity for no purpose at all. Strongly suggested here, isn't it? The life belongs to God. So we see another change in the relationship with the created world here. God graciously protecting against the threat that is posed by the animal kingdom, as well as graciously providing for mankind. and for their fruitful increase on the earth. Well, the second threat to man actually comes from himself. Look at verse 5 with me as we see the threat of mankind. And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each man too. I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man. This is a very interesting addition, isn't it? Now think through the story so far. There's a sort of an irony that goes on in the first chapters of Genesis with this. God has commanded mankind to multiply and fill the earth. So Genesis 1:28, we all know the verse. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." But actually, with what did mankind actually then fill the earth? The word does get repeated, that they do manage to fill the earth with something. It's in Genesis 6. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. They're commanded to fill the earth with glorious image bearers of God. Instead, they fill the earth with violence, violent people. This was not what God had intended when he said to fill the earth. God intends for the earth to be full of his glory, to be filled with those people who are made in his image and who walk by faith on the face of the earth. That the earth should be filled actually with human mirrors of God's glory. But the first incident, actually the first recorded sin outside of the garden, do you remember? It's murder. Cain murders his righteous brother Abel. And yet, graciously, God does not actually take his life. He allows him to live. And we see, a few generations later, his descendant Lamech with violence that's completely out of control. The most violent man. Now God, it seems, establishes a safeguard here. A principle. The murderer should die, says God. They should die. In other words, there is a form of justifiable killing that's established here. If any animal or if any person murders an image bearer of God, then their life is forfeit, says God. By man shall their blood be shed. Now, let me just say here, I don't think there's enough data here for a debate about whether it's right or wrong to have the death penalty in our country. But at the very least, can you just see here, a distinction is being made between murder and lawful execution. In other words, life is not cheap. No life should be treated as such, and human life is especially valuable. That is being established here. You know, that's why it should really be a no-brainer. You're driving down the road, and in the road, walks from either side. You've got a cat on the one side, walks onto the road, and a toddler walks into the road. It should be instinct within us which way we swerve. I love cats, okay? I do love cats. Please don't, that's probably a horrible illustration to use, but do you get the point? Instinctively, we should know the value of human life. What is so special about human life? Well, it's made explicit here in verse 6, isn't it? It's about being made in the image of God. Murdering a human being, no matter how big or small or young or old, is an attack on God himself. Bible teacher John Piper puts it this way: murder is the presumptuous snuffing out of a potential lamp of God's glory. It is rebellion against the image of God and the purpose of God. And so God, who previously has held exclusive rights as being the one who gives life and takes away life, which actually is demonstrated in how he deals with Cain, if you remember. No one's allowed to touch Cain. That's God's prerogative. Now God shares a small part of that prerogative with mankind as a safeguard against the violence in the world, the murder in the world. That's the second threat. Now, the third threat to God's plans for mankind it comes seemingly out of left field. I wonder if you were surprised by it when we made that point. It is God himself. Let's have a look at these wonderful verses in the second half of our reading. Have a look with me down at verse 8. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those who came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is a sign of the covenant that I'm making with you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So God said to Noah, this is a sign of the covenant I've established between me and all life on the earth. Now, I read that all out in full. Can you see the repetition in it? Repetition, repetition, repetition. And the repeated ideas of it's all, it's every, it's never. It's a very strong piece of writing, isn't it? All life, never again. See, the greatest threat to the survival of mankind is God himself. Why? Because he is holy and just, as we saw previously. We saw it last time, didn't we? Now, I don't want to cover the same ground again, but the reason for the absolute catastrophe that hit the earth with the flood, wiping out all life, was that God cannot leave sin unpunished. God is a God of justice and holiness. As soon as mankind starts filling the earth with sin, the clock of God's patience starts to tick. That's the picture, isn't it? The hourglass is running. How will we survive? How will we survive the wrath of God coming on our sin? The answer is a covenant. The answer is a covenant. These verses repeat what God said at the end of chapter 8. Here, God makes an ironclad promise that his world, as long as it exists, will be safe from this kind of destruction. God will, he says, never again take the life of all creatures that breathe. He will never again do it by means of a flood. In fact, I think you can probably go further. He pledges at the end of chapter 8, look, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. Until God wraps up time and wraps up this creation, these things will continue to run under his sovereign control. And by the way, that means that whatever fears you might have about mankind somehow managing to make ourselves extinct through environmental catastrophes or nuclear war, that is not how we end. Do you see? We have the ironclad word of God to say otherwise. God is sustaining our world, and he will continue to do so until the end. God is holding back his just and his right wrath against sin, and he will do so to the end. Now, this is fascinating, and it should strike us. I wonder if you've ever thought about this. Is there anything that God cannot do? Is there anything God cannot do? Actually, he declares that there is. Listen to these words from Hebrews chapter 6. They are wonderful. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 17. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear, to the heirs of what was promised. He confirmed it with an oath. God did this so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope offered to us may be greatly encouraged. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. Do you see this? God cannot lie. 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 13 reminds us this. It says, if we are faithless, says Paul, he, God, remains faithful. For he cannot deny himself. He just can't do it. God cannot break his word. If God were to break his word, if God were to break a covenant that he makes, he has to deny his own character. He has to deny who he is, and he cannot do that. That is a staggering thought, brothers and sisters. It's the foundation of why we feel so secure as God's people. The rainbow, then, we're told here, stands as a reminder between us and God that he has bound himself by a covenant. And mark, it is a one-sided covenant. There's nothing we have to do to keep it. That he will not judge the world in the same way again. Now, I don't think that there weren't any rainbows before the flood. I'm not of that school of thought. But the rainbow, you see, now has this significance. And when we see it, we should remember this. When you see a rainbow, it ought to direct your mind to think of the grace of God. We live under the grace of God, that we are not just struck down for our sin. It is an indictment, and it is a tragic irony that the rainbow has become, for Western civilization, a symbol of the pride that we have in sinful rebellion against God. Have you thought about that? The rainbow might declare that God is holding off sending judgment, the judgment that our sin deserves, that the world deserves. But surely it ought equally to remind all of us, this stark symbol when we see it in the sky, that God did once judge sin. He did once judge the earth for their pride, rebellion, violence, and perversity. Now, if we truly understood the extent of our own sin and what we deserve, then the mere sight of a rainbow would be very sobering. And it would be a great relief to us, at least in this life, that we are spared what we deserve. But those who truly know the depth of their own sin, the sin in their hearts, know that more is needed. God has let us in on how he draws his story to a conclusion. Because he's written the story, he can show us a little bit of the last chapter. He can show us how the story of redemption will actually end. And it ends with the wrapping up of this old creation that is cursed and the bringing in of a new one, a glorious one. The book of Revelation, right in the back of the Bible, pulls back the curtains and reveals to us a little bit of what is to come. Listen to these wonderful words from Revelation chapter 21, where John in a vision says, "Then I saw the new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away." And this creation that John sees will be a new creation where everything is unspoilt, where everything is as it should be, restored, remade, perfect. And it will be filled, have no doubt, with a countless multitude of people from everywhere in the world, made in the image of God and singing his praises and reflecting his glory, just as God always intended. Well, how can that be? How can that possibly be? How will we escape the consequences of our sin, spared from in this life, but in that new creation after this life? Well, it will only be if God again binds himself with a new covenant. And it will have to be a covenant with better promises than this one made in the days of Noah. It cannot be a covenant established with the blood of animals, for a start. We saw last week, all that the blood of animals could do is just defer the problem. That's all the blood of animals can ever do. It will have to be a new covenant that is far, far greater. Listen to the writer of the book of Hebrews. He speaks about just such a covenant established through the blood of Jesus Christ, God's Son. He says this in Hebrews chapter 8, "This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more." It is only through this everlasting covenant that the greatest threat to mankind is finally removed completely. Jesus Christ gives his lifeblood on the cross to establish that covenant. He pays for our sin. He absorbs God's wrath. He satisfies the justice of a holy God who cannot leave sin unpunished by taking that punishment on himself. To have God look at the cross and to declare, "I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more." Well, that is just simply breathtaking. This is the grace of God. And as such, this forgiveness and this peace with God is available to all who will acknowledge their sin and who by faith will turn to him for mercy. Now, if you've never done that, well, I invite you to do that this morning. Come and pray with me after the service, if that's you.